The first light of dawn cast a faint golden hue over the vast grasslands of the wildlife reserve. A gentle breeze rustled through the tall blades of grass, carrying the untamed whispers of the wild. The distant calls of birds echoed through the air, heralding the arrival of a new day. But amidst this tranquil morning, a fragile sound broke the stillness, the soft, trembling cries of a child. There, on the dusty dirt road, sat a small boy, curled up and shivering. His tear-streaked face was flushed, his wide, red-rimmed eyes brimming with fear and sorrow. His blue jacket was covered in dust, and his tiny hands clutched his knees, as if seeking warmth in the cold embrace of loneliness. No one was around, no shelter, no safety, only the vast wilderness, home to prowling predators. From a distance, a massive shadow emerged from behind the swaying grass. Golden eyes, sharp and piercing, gleamed under the rising sun, locked onto the boy. It was Koda, the mighty lion, the undisputed ruler of this land. The child's cries made Koda pause. A strange sensation stirred in the great beast's chest. Something unfamiliar, something beyond instinct. He didn't quite understand it, but something about this small, fragile being was different. Then, suddenly, Koda lifted his head and let out a thunderous roar. The powerful sound rippled through the savannah, shattering the silence of the morning. His eyes remained fixed on the boy, and for a fleeting moment time itself seemed to stand still. Then, like a storm breaking over a silent sky, Koda moved, his massive paws pressed into the dust as he strode forward, closing the distance between himself and the trembling child. The boy lifted his head, his tear-filled eyes locking onto the lion's piercing gaze. His heart pounded, then seemed to stop altogether. There was no escape, no one to turn to, just a small, fragile child, face to face with the ruler of the wild. Years ago, under the vast savannah sky, a nightmare descended as darkness fell. The night was shattered by the crack of gunfire, ripping through the stillness. Under the pale moon, the land was drenched in silent tragedy. Death came suddenly, merciless, cold, and absolute. Amidst the withering grass, a tiny lion cub huddled against the lifeless body of its mother. The only warmth it had ever known was now slipping away, leaving behind nothing but emptiness. Wide, innocent green eyes darted around in desperate search of safety, but the pride was gone. It let out a feeble cry, soft, broken, but the only answer was the whispering wind, carrying the thick scent of blood. Koda lost everything that night, but fate never abandons the strong. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, a man appeared. Elias, a young ranger of the reserve, had seen scenes like this too many times before. Poachers came and went, leaving devastation in their wake. But this time, amidst the senseless slaughter, he found something different, a fragile life that had somehow survived. A tiny lion cub, barely strong enough to stand on its wobbly legs, stared up at Elias with wide, panic-stricken eyes. It did not run, it did not snarl, it simply looked at him, as if waiting for a miracle. And Elias, knowing full well that human intervention in nature was never a simple thing, knelt down and gently lifted the cub into his arms. From that moment on, the fates of Koda and Elias became inseparably intertwined. The days that followed were an uphill battle. Elias woke in the dead of night to feed Koda, soothing him when he cried for his mother. He taught him how to roar, how to pounce on stuffed toys as if they were real prey. But more than anything, Elias understood that if Koda was to survive in the wild, he couldn't just be a lion raised by humans. He had to become a true predator. When Koda grew strong enough to leave the hands of humans, Elias introduced him to a pride of lions. Miraculously, a lioness nursing her own cubs accepted him, an extraordinary rarity in the wild. From that moment, Koda was no longer just a rescued cub. He became a true lion, learning to hunt, fight, and survive. Years passed, and the once fragile creature transformed into a warrior. His strength and imposing size made him one of the dominant rulers of this land. He had fought, roared, and proven himself worthy of being among the strongest. Yet, despite being the king of the reserve, deep within Coda remained a distant memory, one of warmth, of human arms, that had once lifted him from the shadows of death. And it was that very memory, on one fateful day, that led him to make an unthinkable decision. When he found a small, abandoned child in the heart of the wilderness, the sky had turned a brilliant shade of orange as the sun sank toward the horizon. The last golden rays brushed gently against the swaying grass, painting the wild in an enchanting yet perilous beauty. From within the dense thickets, Coda slowly rose. He had spent the day lazily sprawled under the cool shade, letting the breeze wash over him. But now, hunger gnawed at his stomach, stirring the predator within. A low, guttural rumble rumbled from his throat, the signal that the night hunt had begun. He stretched his powerful frame, his sharp claws raking the dry earth before he stepped forward, weaving silently through the underbrush in search of prey. But just as he moved, he suddenly froze. A strange sound drifted through the wind, a faint, trembling cry. Coda lifted his head, ears pricked, golden eyes gleaming with alertness. He sniffed the air, trying to pinpoint the unfamiliar scent carried by the breeze. Human, but not the scent of the rangers he had known. This was different, foreign. Curious, yet wary, Coda began moving toward the sound. On the dusty path, amidst the vast wilderness, a small boy sat curled up, his face streaked with dirt and tears. His flushed cheeks glistened with the trails of his sorrow. His blue jacket was stained with dust, and his tiny hands clutched his body in a desperate attempt to ward off the cold, creeping into his bones. He was too lost in his fear, too consumed by loneliness, to realize that a massive lion now stood just feet away. Coda stopped. Coda began to circle the boy slowly, his piercing gaze never leaving the small, trembling figure. The child's soft sobs echoed in the stillness, his quiet hiccups the only sound against the whispering wind. But strangely, Coda did not lunge like a predator. He only observed, moving with measured steps, as if trying to understand what lay before him. His instincts told him this boy was not prey. But then, something else made Coda freeze. The air grew heavier. Another scent flooded in, stronger, more threatening. From the darkness of the sparse trees, another pair of eyes glowed, sharp, cruel, and hungry. A second lion had appeared. The newcomer was tall and lean, its frame wiry, but no less dangerous. It had been watching Coda from a distance, waiting for the right moment. But now, it had found something else. Something smaller, weaker, utterly defenseless. Its gaze darkened with a predatory hunger as it slowly crept toward the boy. Coda recognized the danger instantly. And then, without warning, a powerful surge of emotion erupted within him. A feeling so intense, so familiar, it transported him back to the night he had cowered beside his mother's lifeless body, trembling and alone in a world that had turned against him. Perhaps, in this frightened little boy, Coda saw himself. And in that moment, without hesitation, Coda acted. Coda threw his head back and unleashed a roar that shook the earth. The sound was so powerful, so commanding, that the boy instantly stopped crying, his wide, tear-filled eyes staring up in shock at the towering beast before him. But Coda's fury was not directed at him. It was aimed at the enemy creeping closer. The rogue lion hesitated, its steps faltering as it registered the sheer force of its opponent, but only for a moment. Then, with a low, guttural growl, it pushed forward, baring its fangs in challenge. No further warnings were needed. Coda lunged, lightning fast. The boy gasped as the massive lion leapt over him, a golden blur against the dimming sky. But the next sound, the sickening crash of two great beasts colliding, made his heart slam against his chest. The two wild titans locked eyes, their claws scraping against the hardened earth. One was a lone predator, an opportunist roaming the land in search of a kill. The other was the king of this domain, a battle-hardened warrior who had faced countless fights before. But this time, Coda wasn't just fighting for his territory. He was fighting for the small, fragile life huddled behind him. The rogue lion crouched low, muscles tensed, growling in a vicious warning, ready to strike at any moment. But Coda didn't wait. With a thunderous roar, he charged. The ground trembled beneath the force of their impact. Dust exploded into the air as the two lions clashed, their razor-sharp claws raking against thick hide, their powerful jaws snapping in a blur of raw strength and fury. The battle had begun. Coda struck with a powerful swipe, sending the rogue lion stumbling backward, but his opponent was not ready to surrender. With a furious snarl, the rogue lunged forward, jaws aimed straight for Coda's throat. The boy screamed in terror as the two lions clashed in a brutal battle for survival. Their bodies twisted and tumbled across the dust-covered earth, each vying for dominance. But Coda remained unfazed. With the speed of the wind, he sidestepped the attack, then used his massive frame to slam his opponent into the ground. The rogue lion thrashed, desperate to regain its footing. But Coda was faster. He seized the moment, letting out a deafening roar. He planted his claws firmly into the dirt just inches from the defeated lion's face. A final warning. The rogue lion stilled, its heaving breaths rattling with frustration. It knew. This fight was lost. With a bitter snarl, it slowly backed away, casting one last glance at the small boy. But when it saw Coda still standing tall, muscles tense, fangs bared in silent threat, it understood. The battle was over. Without hesitation, the defeated lion turned and disappeared into the shadows of the dense forest. Coda remained where he stood, his powerful chest rising and falling with heavy breaths, his keen eyes fixed on the retreating figure until he was certain the intruder was gone. Only then did he turn to face the boy. The child was still sitting there, his wide eyes filled with shock, his small hands gripping each other tightly. But he was no longer crying. He simply stared at Coda, the lion that had just saved his life. A gentle breeze drifted through the clearing, carrying away the tension that had hung thick in the air. Coda stepped closer, standing firmly beside the boy, a towering shield between him and the perilous wilderness. He didn't growl. He didn't bare his teeth. He simply stood there, silent, unwavering, as if to say, "No harm will come to you." In the distance, the deep rumble of an engine cut through the fading twilight. Elias gripped the steering wheel of his Jeep, his heart pounding against his ribs. From the moment he received the distress call about a child in the reserve, his mind had been racing with worst-case scenarios. Every second felt like an eternity, but as he rounded the bend, the scene before him made his blood run cold. Slamming the brakes, Elias jumped out, his boots crunching against the dry earth. The golden glow of the setting sun stretched across the vast grasslands, painting the wild in brilliant hues of amber and crimson. But Elias only saw two things. A small child, sitting frozen in the dust, wide eyes locked onto a massive lion standing right beside him. And that lion was Coda. Elias's chest tightened. The sight before him defied all logic. A wild beast, a predator, yet standing protectively over the boy as if guarding him. The child trembled, but Coda did not move. The wind whispered through the plains, ruffling the thick mane of the mighty lion. He stood firm, his muscular frame unyielding, an impenetrable barrier between the child and the dangers of the wild. His golden eyes, sharp as ever, flickered with cautious vigilance. He wasn't snarling. He showed no signs of aggression. But he wasn't leaving either. Elias knew he had only one chance to do this right. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hands slightly, palms open, a silent assurance that he meant no harm. He made no sudden moves, no hint of fear, because Elias understood Coda was not just a mindless beast. He was a warrior, a survivor, a lion who had been forged in the unforgiving heart of the wild. But more than anything, this was the lion he had once saved. Elias took a step forward. Coda didn't move. Elias took another step. The lion blinked slowly, his tail sweeping lightly across the dirt, a measured, deliberate movement. Elias recognized it instantly. This wasn't aggression. This was a test. Coda was assessing him, weighing whether the man before him was still the same one from his past. Elias stopped, lowering himself slightly, his gaze steady on Coda. "Coda," he murmured, his voice low and gentle, carried by the wind. The lion didn't react right away, but something subtle shifted in his posture. His massive head tilted just slightly, considering. His ears flicked at the sound of the name, at the familiar cadence of a voice that had once been a part of his world. Elias pressed on. "It's me. I won't hurt the boy." Coda held his gaze, those deep golden eyes reflecting something far beyond the instincts of a wild predator. There was recognition, faint but undeniable. Somewhere in the depths of his mind, a memory surfaced, a misty morning, warm arms lifting his frail body, a quiet voice soothing him in the loneliest days of his youth. And for the first time, Coda hesitated. This man, Elias waited, patient and unwavering. And then, as if a decision had finally been made, Coda moved. Night descended upon the reserve, the sky stretching into a deep shade of violet, stars shimmering against the dark expanse, their light reflected in the glass windows of the ranger's station, casting faint glimmers across the dimly lit room. Inside, the soft glow of a computer screen flickered against Elias's tense face. He sat motionless, eyes locked onto the surveillance footage, fingers gripping the computer mouse so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He was searching for answers. That child. Why had he been abandoned in the heart of such a dangerous land? Elias rewound the footage, rolling back the clock to a few hours earlier. The image flickered briefly before stabilizing. The camera feed showed the secondary entrance to the reserve, a remote section where the fence wasn't as reinforced as other areas. And then, he saw it. On the screen, an old battered car crawled out of the dust-covered road, its weak engine rattling before sputtering to a stop right at the edge of the reserve's perimeter. Elias narrowed his eyes, leaning in to see more clearly. Through the dim glow of the headlights, he could make out two figures inside. A young man sat behind the wheel, his face tense, rigid with unspoken turmoil. Beside him, in the passenger seat, was a woman with long, disheveled hair, her posture taut with urgency. The car door swung open. The woman stepped out hastily, her bare feet pressing against the cold earth, trembling against the night's chill. In her arms, wrapped tightly in a blue jacket, was a small child. It was him, the boy. Elias's heartbeat pounded in his chest. His eyes remained locked onto the screen, following the woman's every move. She looked around anxiously, her gaze darting back and forth as if searching for something, someone. And then, as if she had found what she was looking for, she knelt down, her hands trembling as she reached for a weak spot in the fence. A small gap, a flaw in the barrier where the metal bars had loosened over time. She slipped through, carrying the child with her. Elias clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening against the desk. His breath hitched as the scene unfolded before him. The woman lowered herself onto the dry, dusty ground, gently setting the boy down. He was too drowsy to understand. His small hands rubbed at his sleepy eyes, fingers grasping at the air as if searching for something to hold on to. But his mother, she wasn't there to hold him. She stared at him, her eyes brimming with sorrow. Then she leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to his forehead. It wasn't hurried, it wasn't cold or indifferent. It was full of love, full of heartbreak. A kiss that held the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. A final memory to etch his warmth into her heart. A moment she could never take back. The boy mumbled something, his voice barely more than a whisper, but she bit down on her lip, forcing herself to stay silent, to hold back the tears threatening to spill. And then, she stood. She turned away, slipping back through the fence in a desperate rush, as if any hesitation would shatter what little strength she had left. She didn't look back. Inside the car, the young alone in the wild, Elias let go of the computer mouse, leaning back in his chair. A slow, heavy breath slipped from his lips. His eyes remained fixed on the frozen image on the screen, the small child sitting on the dusty road, his tiny hands reaching out in quiet desperation, searching for the mother who had vanished into the night. This wasn't abandonment. This wasn't cruelty. This was helplessness. Elias clenched his fists. A storm of questions raged in his mind. Why had they done this? Who were they? What had driven them to leave their child in a place as dangerous as this? But there was one thing he knew for certain. They had no other choice. The way the woman knelt down, the way she held her child one last time, the anguish in her eyes. Elias had seen people abandon animals. He had even seen people abandon their own children. But this was not rejection. This was sacrifice. Had she known that a ranger might find him? Did she believe that here in the reserve, her child would have a better chance? Elias didn't know. He only knew one thing. From this moment on, the boy was no longer alone. Elias stood, inhaling deeply before turning toward the door. In the ranger's office, the child still sat where Elias had left him, wrapped tightly in the blanket he had been given. He wasn't crying anymore, but his eyes held a sorrow too heavy for someone so small. Elias knelt beside him, resting a gentle hand on his shoulder. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice low and steady. The boy blinked, hesitating for a moment before whispering a name so faint it was barely audible. "Daniel." Elias nodded. "All right, Daniel. You're going to be okay." And though he had no idea what the future would hold, Elias knew one thing for certain. He would do everything in his power to keep that promise. The next morning, the sun rose over the vast savanna, casting a golden glow across the endless fields of tall grass. Inside the small wooden cabin at the reserve, Elias sat in a simple chair, his gaze fixed on the little boy sitting on the bed, still clutching the soft blanket around him. The boy, Daniel, he hadn't cried since last night. No more muffled sobs, no more frightened glances, but the silence that had settled over him weighed heavier on Elias than any tears ever could. Daniel was only 3 years old, a child who should have been sleeping in a warm room, surrounded by bedtime stories and the comforting arms of his parents. But instead, he had been left in the heart of the wild, a place where a lion had shielded him from a cruel fate. Elias let out a quiet sigh and stood up. He stepped closer, lowering himself to Daniel's level. "Daniel, are you hungry?" he asked gently. The boy blinked, then slowly shook his head, but almost immediately, his small stomach betrayed him with a soft rumble. Elias smiled. "I've got some bread and milk. Want to try a little?" Daniel hesitated for a moment before nodding faintly. Elias placed the plate in front of him, but instead of reaching for the food right away, Daniel simply stared at it. After a long pause, he carefully tore off a small piece of bread and slowly brought it to his mouth. Elias didn't say anything. He just watched. Every movement Daniel made was careful, hesitant, as if he feared that the slightest mistake would cause everything around him to disappear. Elias felt a tightness in his chest. But in the days that followed, Daniel slowly began to open up. The first time he laughed was when Elias showed him a video on his phone, a clip of lion cubs tumbling over each other, playing under the warm sun. "They're so big!" Daniel exclaimed, his eyes lighting up with wonder. Elias chuckled. "Those are just cubs. Do you want to see them in real life?" Daniel's head bobbed up and down eagerly, excitement gleaming in his gaze. The next day, Elias lifted Daniel into the jeep and drove through the dusty trails of the reserve. When they reached a vast open plain where lions often roamed, Elias brought the vehicle to a stop and pointed ahead. "There," he said. Daniel lifted his head, his eyes going wide as he spotted a group of lions basking under the warm sunlight. A lioness was gently grooming her cubs, while the playful little ones clambered over her back, tumbling in the golden grass. "Look!" Daniel pointed excitedly, his voice brimming with joy. Elias couldn't stop smiling as he watched the pure happiness on the boy's face. "Do you know who saved you?" Elias asked, his tone soft. Daniel turned to him, his round eyes filled with curiosity. "It was Coda, the big lion that stood between you and danger." The boy was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting back to the lions. "Can I see Coda?" he asked, his voice hopeful. Elias chuckled. "If we're lucky, we just might." The more time they spent together, the more Elias realized something. Daniel had grown attached to him faster than he had expected. Every morning, Daniel trailed behind Elias, his small footsteps pattering across the wooden floor of the reserve station as he followed him everywhere. He sat in the back of the jeep whenever Elias went to check on the wildlife, his round, curious eyes constantly scanning the vast landscape, and the questions never stopped. Why do lions sleep so much? Do giraffes ever sit down? Are antelopes fast enough to escape lions? Elias answered every single one, patient and steady, like a father teaching his son about the world. One evening, as the sky turned to shades of amber and deep violet, Elias sat on the wooden porch, watching the distant horizon. The reserve stretched endlessly before him, bathed in the soft glow of twilight. Then, without a word, Daniel climbed onto the chair beside him. The boy didn't say anything. He simply reached out, his tiny fingers gripping the fabric of Elias's shirt, as if afraid that if he let go, Elias might disappear. Elias looked down at him, and something in his chest tightened. A thought crept into his mind, one that had never occurred to him before. What if they never found Daniel's family? Elias had grown used to him, used to the sound of his laughter ringing through the station, the endless stream of innocent questions, the way his little hands clutched at Elias's own when he fell asleep. And the idea of Daniel leaving one day, it left an emptiness inside him that he couldn't explain. A few weeks later, Elias received a call from the authorities. We've tried to locate the boy's family, but no one has come forward to claim him. The words hit Elias like a punch to the chest. So, his voice came out rough, almost hesitant. By protocol, he'll have to be placed in an orphanage. From there, we hope a family will adopt him. Elias gripped the phone tighter, his fingers curling around it as if trying to hold something together that was slipping away. He glanced over at Daniel. The boy was sitting on the floor, completely unaware of the conversation taking place. He was playing with a small piece of wood, humming softly to himself, lost in the simple joy of childhood, oblivious to the fact that his world was about to change forever. Elias couldn't let that happen. He didn't know how to be a father. He didn't know if he would be enough, if he could provide everything a child needed. But there was one thing he knew, with more certainty than anything else. Daniel belonged with him. "Wait," Elias said, his voice steady, deliberate. He took a deep breath, feeling his heartbeat pounding in his chest. "I'll adopt him." Silence filled the other end of the line before the official finally spoke. "Are you sure? The adoption process won't be easy." Elias looked at Daniel again. The boy was still playing, his little voice rambling on about lions and adventures, blissfully unaware that his fate was being decided at that very moment. A slow smile tugged at Elias's lips. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Elias stepped into the local government office, his posture firm, his resolve unshaken. "You want to do what?" The case officer blinked at him in surprise. "Adopt Daniel," Elias said, his voice steadier than ever. The officer studied him for a long moment before slowly setting his pen down. "Do you understand what this means?" Elias nodded. "I do, and I've thought about it carefully." The official leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You're a wildlife ranger. Your life is in the wilderness. A child can't grow up in a reserve." "Then why was he found there?" Elias countered immediately. "If nature isn't meant for children, then why did a lion protect him instead of killing him? Why was I the one who found him, and not someone else?" The man across from him fell silent. Elias took a deep breath and pressed on. "I won't pretend this is conventional, but Daniel has already been abandoned once. I won't let it happen again. He needs a home, and I intend to give him one. Daniel has no one else. I'm the only one who can take care of him, the same way I once cared for Coda when he was just an abandoned, fragile cub. And look at what Coda became. A proud warrior, a ruler of this land. I can't promise Daniel will become a warrior, but I can promise he'll grow up with love and protection." The official studied Elias for a long moment before letting out a slow sigh. "You understand the adoption process is complicated, right?" "I don't care how long it takes," Elias responded instantly. "I'll do whatever it takes." The months that followed were the hardest of Elias's life. Interviews, home evaluations, stacks of legal paperwork, Background checks. Every step had to be meticulously completed. He faced scrutiny from social workers, long meetings with government officials, endless forms that made the process feel like an uphill battle. Elias had faced wild animals, stood his ground against predators, and navigated the unpredictable dangers of the wilderness. But nothing terrified him more than the thought of losing Daniel over a few lines of bureaucratic text. Yet, through every exhausting challenge, one thing kept him going. Every time he returned to the reserve, Daniel was there, racing to the door, throwing his little arms around Elias, his voice bursting with excitement as he chatted about his day. Nothing was more precious than that. And finally, after what felt like an eternity, the final papers were signed. As the first rays of dawn bathed the reserve in golden light, Elias stood on the porch, gripping a single piece of paper in his hands. His heart pounded as his eyes traced over the words printed on it. Adoption decree. Elias Morgan is hereby the legal adoptive father of Daniel. He could hardly believe it. His fingers trembled slightly, but a slow, genuine smile spread across his lips. No words could capture the emotion swelling in his chest. A deep, overwhelming relief. A happiness unlike anything he had ever known. Folding the paper carefully, he tucked it into his jacket pocket and stepped outside. Daniel was sitting in the dirt, playing with a small branch, but the moment he saw Elias, he immediately dropped it and ran toward him, his tiny hand instinctively reaching for Elias's, just as he always did. Elias knelt down, looking into the boy's wide, innocent eyes. "From today on, you don't have to go anywhere," he said softly. Daniel blinked up at him. "Really?" Elias nodded. "I get to stay here? With you?" "No." Elias smiled, his voice thick with emotion. "With Dad." Daniel's eyes went round, his little lips parting in surprise. And then, without warning, he launched himself into Elias's arms, wrapping his small arms around his neck and holding on tightly. Elias closed his eyes and embraced him just as tightly, holding on to him like he never wanted to let go. From a distance, across the vast open plains, a massive lion stood tall, his golden mane rippling in the breeze. Coda watched them. His deep, amber eyes followed Elias and Daniel as they stood together, as if he somehow understood that a new story had begun, a story no longer just his own, but one of a family forged by fate in the heart of the wild. And as Elias and Daniel turned toward their small home, Coda quietly turned as well. With slow, powerful strides, he walked toward the horizon, vanishing into the boundless savanna, carrying with him the spirit of the untamed land. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the reserve in fiery shades of orange and gold. The warm hues stretched across the endless grasslands, while the evening breeze whispered through the tall blades, carrying the scent of the earth, the wild, and the creatures that belonged to it. Elias drove his jeep down the familiar dusty trail, his hands steady on the wheel. He glanced sideways at the boy beside him. Daniel, his chin resting on the edge of the window, stared outside with wide, eager eyes. He had grown since the day Elias first found him, stronger, more confident. The fear that once clouded his gaze had been replaced with wonder, excitement, and a sense of belonging. "Are we going to see Coda soon?" Daniel asked, his voice soft but filled with anticipation. Elias smiled, reaching over to ruffle the boy's soft hair. "Soon, kiddo. If we're lucky, he'll come to us." The jeep rolled forward, moving slowly through the familiar terrain, past grazing antelopes, past towering elephants making their steady march across the vast savanna. But Daniel barely noticed any of them. He was waiting for only one moment, the moment he would see Coda again. And then, as if fate had planned it all along, Elias suddenly brought the jeep to a halt. In the distance, bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun, a powerful figure stood atop a raised mound of earth. Coda, the massive lion's mane rippled in the evening breeze, his golden eyes scanning the land below with the regal presence of a king. He stood as if he were a part of the savanna itself, untamed, indomitable, as if this land had been made for him and him alone. Daniel drew in a sharp breath. "Coda!" he called out, his voice bright and clear, carrying across the open plains. The great lion stirred, his ears twitched at the familiar sound, and slowly his gaze lowered. For a fleeting moment, those fierce golden eyes locked onto the small boy sitting in the jeep. And in that instant, recognition passed between them. Amidst the vast wilderness, in a land ruled by nature's untamed will, something miraculous happened. Coda recognized them. He did not roar like a predator. He did not turn away like a ghost of the wild. Instead, he stood still, his golden eyes fixed on the boy he had once protected, as if assessing, wondering if the child remembered him too. And then, without hesitation, without any prompting, Daniel raised his hand and waved. "Coda!" Elias held his breath. He had no idea how the lion would react. Would Coda dismiss them? Would he vanish into the savannah like the wild creature he had always been? But then, something no one could have predicted happened. Coda lowered his head, not in aggression, not in fear. A slow, deliberate bow. Elias had seen lions in countless battles for dominance. He had watched them stalk prey, defend their territory, and assert their power. But never, not once, had he seen a lion bow. And yet, here was Coda, the king of this land, offering a silent acknowledgement to the small boy who had once sat trembling beneath his towering presence. It was not submission, it was recognition, a bond unbroken by time, by fear, by the divide between man and beast. A gesture of acknowledgement, a silent greeting from the king of the savannah to the child he had once saved. Daniel giggled, his face glowing like the morning sun. "See, Coda remembers me." Elias smiled, his heart swelling with warmth at the sight before him. He had long dreamed of this moment, the day Daniel would be old enough to understand the miracle of Coda, to know that the mighty lion standing before him had once chosen to protect him rather than hunt him, that in a world governed by instinct and survival, Coda had defied nature itself to become an unseen guardian. And one day, when Daniel was older, Elias would tell him the whole story, the story of a child abandoned in the wild, the story of a lion who chose to shield him instead of harm him, the story of a ranger who broke every rule, every barrier, to hold on to the fragile life that fate had placed in his arms, a story of family, not one bound by blood, but by fate, by love, and by something stronger than anything else in this world. Daniel kept waving at Coda, his small hands fluttering in the golden light, and Elias simply sat there, watching it all, knowing, without a doubt, that no matter how much the world changed, this family had been forged under the wild sky, bound together forever. The wind whispered through the endless grasslands, carrying with it the unspoken tale of a lion, a lost child, and the man who had saved them both. Elias remained in the jeep, his gaze fixed on Daniel, who beamed with pure joy as he waved at Coda. His laughter was light and free, untouched by the pain and loss that had once defined his past. And in that moment, Elias knew Daniel was finally home. Watching the boy, Elias knew he had done the right thing. He had once doubted himself, once feared that he wasn't capable of being a father. But then, he realized that love wasn't about being perfect. Love was found in the most unexpected moments. When a lion chose to protect a child instead of harm him. When a man chose to break every barrier to hold on to a fragile life placed in his hands. Family wasn't always defined by blood. Sometimes, family was formed by fate, by invisible threads that wove lost souls together. Elias knew that one day Daniel would ask. He would want to know why he had been left behind, why his birth parents had chosen to abandon him in the middle of a wildlife reserve. And Elias wouldn't have all the answers, but he would tell Daniel this, that he was never truly abandoned, because from the very first moment he had been protected by a lion, welcomed by a man who refused to let him go, and given a family that he had always deserved. And perhaps, when Daniel is old enough to understand this story, he will look out toward the endless horizon, toward the wild land where Coda still roams, and smile, because he will know that once a lion stood guard over him, that in the midst of life's hardships, he found a father. And that family is not just where we are born, it is where our heart truly belongs. But what about you? Do you think Elias made the right choice in keeping Daniel with him? If you were in his place, what would you have done? Share your thoughts, because love and courage are not just things found in stories. They are things we can all discover in our own lives.